if you look at what was happening on the streets of Rostov-on-Don, when Wagner guys came there, there was a lot of cheering to them. And there was a lot of booing to police who came thereafter. It just shows that pro-Putin and anti-Putin like dichotomy as kind of some coordinates that help us to measure their Russian political attitude is just wrong. Because where there comes another force that presents itself more brutish, patriotic, more militant in a sense, people cheer it as well.
A mutiny in Russia. To discuss, I have on Kamil Galeev, my former classmate at Peking University, formerly with the Wilson Center, to discuss. Kamil, welcome back to ChinaTalk. So, Kamil, is what we saw over the past week a coup?
More like unsuccessful attempt of a coup. But even if unsuccessful, it is still consequential. And I would say it's more consequential than it could be in many Latin American or Asian countries of the world. Because what many foreign observers may not know or may underappreciate is that army in Russia has not really been a factor of big politics for the most time. An interesting feature of the Russian regime, including the Soviet period, is the exclusion of the party from the big politics. There are some exceptions, of course, especially during the transfer of power. For example, after the death of Stalin. But for the most part, the army was not a factor of politics, and the influence in the military was not really converted into the faction strife. So what we see here, what we have seen in the past days, it was probably the largest attempt to do so, the most significant attempt to do so for the last 70 years, I would say.
Let's take a step back. What do you think were the main motivations of Prigozhin taking this step?
Great question. Obviously, what has just happened, it looks very shady, but things like this do usually look shady. And attempted or successful coups, they usually involve or often involve at least some element of 4D chess by the political leadership. So different forces try playing their own games. So, of course, some people and like many observers in Russia or in Eastern Europe or in Ukraine would kind of write it off or discard what happened as kind of staged events. But even if staged, theoretically, even if the events were staged, their consequences were still real. For example, consider the Kornilov Putsch in 1917. It's highly probable, some would say it's almost certain, that the events in August-September 1917 were involved 4D chess by then the provisional government, Alexander Kerensky. So at least he somehow participated in it. So in a sense, the attempt of a coup was orchestrated by the supreme leadership. But even if it was orchestrated, even if it was staged, the consequences were still real. So what we are going to see now, I would say it's very similar. So the closest historical metaphor we can find, the closest historical parallel would be the Kornilov Putsch.
Yeah. So sorry. So the argument is, some people are saying actually, maybe this was like a Putin move all along for him to be able to sort of exert his power. But you're arguing that, maybe that's the case. But even if it was, this leaves him in a way weaker situation than he was a few weeks ago.
Absolutely. Now, I could give you several speculations that are based on nothing except for speculations. One speculation could be that Prigozhin's coup was kind of an element of negotiation, not of internal, but of external negotiation with the West and especially with the US. So basically, just look, if you kind of continue pressuring me even more, some group of crazy gangsters, crazy criminals and Nazis can just, maybe if not take power, then at least take some parts of our nuclear arsenal, catastrophe will follow. Stop pressuring me. That is a purely speculation, but it is itself not impossible. Another element, another explanation could be that it was an attempt to scare the Russian elites themselves. So basically, if I fall down, you all go with me. So some kind of horrible, absolutely unhinged rascals are going to take power, and that will include terrible consequences for everyone. That is another explanation. So, and of course, we could develop some more speculations like this. It is absolutely possible. It is absolutely possible that a few of them have some element of truth. That is absolutely possible. And it is very plausible that at least some factions in power participated in orchestrating and staging what we have seen. But, even if orchestrated and even if staged, the consequences still are real. First, when we say orchestrated, when we say staged, we should keep in mind that complex and sophisticated 4D chess often just does not work, or it works, or it goes wrong. Everything can go wrong. My favorite story is the assassination of Emperor Paul. So basically, Emperor Paul in 1801, he invited the general governor of St. Petersburg, Count Polin, and basically told him, you see, there is an attempt of coup. They basically are preparing a coup against me. He said, yes, your majesty, I know it, and I participate in a coup. Like, what? Yes, of course, I participate in a coup. So, I'm one of participants just to collect information, so everything is under control. Ah, great, said the emperor. He was calmed down. He decided it's okay. Very soon he was killed. And General Governor Count Polin was the main organizer. He basically said it directly. So, one element of a situation, even if the supreme power is actually aware of everything, it kind of keeps control. Everything can go wrong for too many reasons. But that is more on tactical level. If we go on strategic level, it looks even more complicated. It looks more complicated because what we have seen, it basically legitimizes the use of the military, of direct military force, in the, internal competition of factions, internal competition of interest groups, which previously they tried to avoid. So if you look the previous attempt that it never really materialized, but their previous attempt at least to consolidate a base for a potential military coup, it was in Yeltsin's era with General Rokhlin. But they didn't even really start. They're still preparing and preparing and preparing. And what we have seen, that you can actually start it, and you can achieve very significant results. So in a sense, that normalizes the use of the military for advancing your, basically, interests of your faction.
Yeah. So we did a show, I guess it must have been close to a year ago now, where we were discussing, you were sort of discussing this vision of a future where you have, all the different governors and, private players trying to amass their own sort of independent military chips that they could then deploy to gain a share or secure their place in whatever the future of Russia is. And I thought it was really far-fetched until we had the rise of these private armies and this sort of dramatic events over the past 72 hours or so. So how does this sort of how does everyone in the system learning that this is possible, that sort of these tactics are, both legitimized as well as can take you to 200 miles of Moscow, end up sort of changing the chessboards and the different players' incentives as they look into the second half of 2023?
You see, I think a very interesting aspect of this kind of attempted coup or staged coup, as some would say, is who is doing it. Who is doing it? Because who's Prigozhin, basically? He's an agent of the power. He's an agent. It is not some, let's say, independent baron or some person who rose independently from Putin. It's basically a very petty, gangster who was just for the fact of his membership in the St. Petersburg gang that took power, who was commissioned by Putin to do the dirty job for him. Abroad, in Russia, in Ukraine, that's really the only source of his power. So in a sense, it's kind of very revealing, because it's not, let's say, some regional interest groups or some region or some provincial actors. who are taking the move against their supreme power, but it is its own agents. And I think it's really, really interesting. Machiavelli, back in 16th century, he kind of made a distinction between two types of regimes. And the ones like France and the ones like Turkey, well, the Ottoman Empire. So basically, what was his point? That regimes like the French one, they are relatively easy to overthrow, but it's very difficult to keep control over them. Why? Because in France, there's a lot of like feudal barons, basically. So on the one hand, it's pretty easy to get into alliance with some of them against the central power. So it's relatively easy to take control over. But once you did it, you don't really rule because there are still lots of barons and you can't do anything about that. So it's more like baronial type of regime, baronial. But the Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, it would be a very different type of regime. Didn't really have strong baronial factions to the same extent. So on the one hand, it may be more difficult to defeat it because you don't have any independent powers to get into alliance with. But once you took control, it's very easy to keep it. It's very easy to keep it because there was no independent power for you to conspire with. There's no independent power that could stand against you now. So now it's a very important part. A very important part is people from baronial regimes, like naturally, who are shaped by baronial regimes, who grew up in baronial regimes, who know baronial regimes, they generally fail to comprehend. It's hard for them. Another type of regimes who are more like courtier and centered around the royal court. Now the thing is, America, under this classification, it would be baronial-like regime, baronial run. In a sense, I don't want to offend anyone, more like 16th century France than the 16th century Ottoman Empire. Russia, in this regard, would fall under second category, which means that many things happening in Russia, they're just intuitively ununderstandable for Americans. So I would say a lot of political realities of the US, they're just incomprehensible for most of Russians because they are too different from what they're used to, and the other way around. People who lived under baronial regimes cannot comprehend courtier-run regimes, and the other way around. Consider the following. For Russians, it would be absolutely incomprehensible that bureaucracy, federal government in DC had prepared a genius plan of how to, let's say, reorganize America. Basically, some version of the Green New Deal. But then there comes some congressman from West Virginia, Mountain Mama, and he basically blocks it. And he blocks it. Unimaginable. Now the thing is, most Russian people, including people with resources, people with power, they would not really believe that really happened. There should have been some play, some 4D chess within the federal government. They wouldn't believe that some senators from West Virginia, Oklahoma, Alabama, wherever, whom we would designate as barons under this classification, would really have so much saying. For example, in whether budget passes or not. And the other way around. So the thing about Russia that would be incomprehensible for Americans is that it does not really have strong baronial factions. They exist, but they are very, very much weaker. It is courtier-run to the extent against unimaginable to most Americans. So when there is a upheaval, when there is, let's say, betrayal, it is most probably will not be barons who do it, because barons are weak. It is most probably will be courtiers. So, paradoxically enough, Kremlin may fear the most dangerous, the largest danger, not from some kind of, let's say, regional separatists, or even governors, or some provincial interest groups, but primarily from its own agents on the federal level, because there is no one else who really has resources.
Let's do the courtiers first. So, the sort of Prigozhins in waiting, or other folks who are in the inner circle and do have sort of independent resources or means to I don't know, do crazy things. How does their calculus change now that they've seen, what Prigozhin's been able to do over the past week?
We cannot answer this 100% because obviously these guys will not share their position outspokenly. So we can only read the clues. But what we can read is that first, we have seen that the military uprising is basically possible. It is not impossible, let's say, because for the most part, most of military structures, paramilitary structures, when facing a coup, they do nothing. I know it sounds strange, but it looks like most of military and paramilitary in the region where the attempted coup took place, they did not join them, but they did not stand against them either. So basically, in a sense, they acted more like a part of a landscape. That's one thing. Another is that there's quite a lot of public enthusiasm. So if you look at what was happening on the streets of Rostov on Don, when Wagner guys came there was a lot of cheering to them, and there was a lot of booing to police who came thereafter. And it is really, really interesting, because those southern regions, more like Belgorod, Rostov, Krasnodar, they are really conservative, socially conservative. They are relatively well off. They are very much pro-war, absolutely, much more than average in Russia. And they have been traditionally framed as very pro-Putin regions in Russia, very pro-Putin. But it just shows that pro-Putin and anti-Putin like dichotomy as kind of some coordinates that help us to measure their Russian political attitudes is just wrong. Because where there comes another force that presents itself more brutish, patriotic, more militant in a sense, people cheer it as well. Actually, it looks like people in regions that have been traditionally deemed as very, very pro-Putin, they prefer some kind of warlord, in this sense Prigozhin, to the Putin's rule. I think this is very, very interesting observation. So these people, even if they did not really do anything to help or to obstruct this revolt, they are absolutely willing to accept the intrusion of the military and paramilitary into the political affairs. They're basically waiting for it.
Truly one of the more remarkable pieces of this whole story were those videos of folks cheering the Wagner tanks as they were rolling into the city. I want to stay on that kind of that insight that you made of like the sort of old map of pro anti-Putin doesn't make sense in this new era of wartime. Sort of, I guess, what are the broader implications of the, I guess, like revealed preference of like the supposedly most nationalist people in Russia that you saw over the past few days?
You see, how could we actually make more sense out of these videos on Rostov? They just show why these like preferences pro or against Putin don't make much sense. You see, there's a lot of like discourse when people, for example, analyze the electoral maps in Russia. Oh, this region like, have traditionally voted pro-Putin, or this against. It has some sense. It's not like completely senseless or meaningless. But these people and these analysts, they wrongly assume Russia has elections. It does not. It never had, at least on presidential level. Why? Because elections have options. There can be different options. For example, let's say during next elections, you could potentially go vote for one candidate, or you could go potentially vote for another candidate, and you cannot be 100% sure who wins. You see? We cannot be 100% sure. There is still some intrigue. There is some anticipation for results. In Russia, because in America, the supreme executive power has changed as a result of elections many times. So America has elections. Russia does not, and it never had, because supreme executive power in Russia never changes as a result of elections. So, but elections are still taking place formally. It just means this is not the elections, this is the acclamation. Acclamations. like some acclamation for Byzantine emperor. So basically, you kind of succeed to power, but you still need to go through acclamation, which you'll get. And that's like presidential elections in Russia will be more properly framed as presidential acclamations. Yeltsin perfectly got his acclamations with like rate of approval of 6%, no problem at all. Putin got all the time, but it shows that the crowd that would readily acclaim him would acclaim other guys too.
And that must make some people's eyes really wide, who are, who are potentially ambitious or frustrated with the way things are going.
Yes. And also there is another moment is that one element is standing of Putin among within the circle of the Russian ruling elite. Because one thing he could one card he had that other did not, he could maybe potentially say explicitly or more like imply, like, people hate you, every one of you, but they love me. So I'm the only one of you like truly legitimate. Because basically the only reason for you to enjoy your position is because of me. I legitimize you all. People love me. And that would be a very strong argument. But now it looks very much weaker argument that it would be even a few months ago.
How's Putin's like decision space been constrained by what's happened?
Well, on the one hand, his positions are now probably somewhat weaker because other members of the ruling circle see that the willingness to acclaim Putin and the willingness to cheer Putin, it's not necessarily all about Putin. People in general and population in the regions that were deemed as very pro-Putinist, it is ready to cheer and to acclaim pretty much everyone. So it's not some unique property of Putin which makes him irreplaceable for the existing elite. This may not be a drastic change, may not be a dramatic change, but still the experiment has been conducted. That's one thing. So now he has much less of an argument that people love me and they do not necessarily love you. That's one element. Another is that Putin will be most probably forced to do some kind of repressions against those who showed themselves prone to supporting Wagner. Because what the situation has revealed, that lots of military and paramilitary, if they did not outright support what they saw as mutiny, they did not raise a finger either. That includes paratroopers, that includes much of like warrior corps, some like infantry, some parts of the infantry, which means most probably that the regime does not see all these fellows as absolutely loyal when it comes regarding facing the internal enemy. So there will be probably some purges, not necessarily bloody, and some elements of repression. And I believe we're already seeing them on some of the more gruesome videos, usually with like Chechens, like cutting the throats of soldiers who like deemed to be pro-Wagner. Which is, Marx once wrote, I believe it was like Ignatius Brumaire, that history repeats itself 2 times. First as a tragedy, second time as a comedy. So basically it looks more like a comedy of Kornilov Puch. So basically there is some kind of mutiny, regime suppresses this mutiny successfully, but the repressions and purges it has to conduct thereafter, they make it very much weaker against mutinies by the forces.
What do you think are the implications for the war in Ukraine?
Implications for the war in Ukraine. You see, when I was just scrolling what Ukrainian authors, including those very close to the ruling regime in Ukraine, were writing, many were excessively optimistic. Basically, there was a lot of wish, a lot of desire for the regime in Russia to fall immediately and for the war to stop. I don't think, well, it obviously did not happen, and it will not happen for a while. But once to move on using the military force in internal political the games have been broken, I think that the regime is now very much weaker, and perspectives they look better. They look better. Personally, my personal prediction, my belief is that we will see a second attempt, not necessarily by the same force, quite probably by another force, but the second attempt of a coup within 3-6 months.
So, you mentioned earlier 1917, and obviously the Bolsheviks came to power on the back of mass frustration and exhaustion in over the war with Germany. And the parallels aren't exact, but Camille, you know this stuff better than I do. What lessons do you think are worth reflecting on from Kerensky's fall and Lenin's rise, and how they apply to today's situation?
Well, many are making these parallels. Putin himself is making these parallels exactly. So basically, he compared this attempt of a mutiny to what was happening in 1917, when these like dark forces stabbed in the back of our like fighting people in the army and stuff. So these parallels have been already normalized. I think the parallel may be also, Bolsheviks, of course, they followed the Marxist dogma, so they had to kind of frame it as a workers' rebellion. Well, there could be an element, but it certainly was not a defining element. So I think that the moving forces, at least what was the actual force of Bolsheviks, was not the workers, obviously, but first and foremost the St. Petersburg garrison and the Baltic Navy. So it were not so much the rebellious workers as people in gray coats and in navy coats. That's it, basically. And interestingly enough, in the first years after the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks leaders, they kind of did not even like call it a revolution. They called it October Coup. So what we did was a coup. And coup primarily relies on military and paramilitary, what happened in reality. But once Bolsheviks took power, and once they consolidated their power base, and once they consolidated their regime, they made it their top priority to prevent any potential threat from the military, basically from ever challenging their rule. That was the priority number one, I would say. And actually, I would ascribe much of what maybe foreign observers would see as an inefficiency of Red Army or Soviet Army to it being optimized for another purpose, optimized for other purpose. For example, it was largely, as I think, optimized for a purpose of not challenging the rule of the Communist Party. So, for example, that means you are very heavily centralized, you don't have very much like right of decision making, relatively few of decisions are delegated, which kind of can hurt your fighting efficiency, but it makes you less of a political challenge. And you know what? It was successful. So, for many decades, Communist Party ruled successfully, and until recently, there was no attempt or a coup from the military that was anyway as close from materializing as happened just recently. Because all other attempts, they were suppressed on the very, very early stages. Usually even before they like actually tried to do anything. Usually on the stage of talking.
Other sort of like lessons from history that you want to apply to this situation?
So kind of summarizing what I said about coups, just to sum it all up. Coups are something that happens in relatively centralized regimes. The precondition for a coup is usually centralization, because if it's sufficiently decentralized, you don't get a coup, you get a civil war. That's quite different. But for a coup, you need centralization. Second, while, of course, interest groups that takes power during a coup, it may legitimize it taking power through kind of appeal to the people. It's not necessarily the people who do it. It's usually done by military and paramilitary forces. People are usually a source of legitimization than actual tool. I love how, like, Enver Pasha did it during the Young Turk Revolt. So basically, during the raid on Sublime Port, I believe it 1913, a leader of mutineers, he came to the Grand Vizier, kind of prime minister of the Ottoman Empire, and demanded him to write a letter of resignation. So he starts writing, at the suggestion of the military and the people, tells Enver Pasha. Well, and the people, writes minister. So basically, in this regard, people play more of a role of a source of legitimization. Because those doing the coup, they cannot just say it by their own name. So number 3, interestingly enough, people are usually passive. In the sense that they can cheer for one force, they can boo at another, but paradoxically enough, in a centralized regime, they don't usually do much. So during such events, most of the population, almost all of it, is usually rather passive. And number four is that in regimes that are sufficiently centralized, it also means that there is little power of barons and a lot of power of courtiers. It usually will be courtiers who will do it. So paradoxically enough, sufficiently centralized regime faces the greatest danger from its own agents.
Any other final thoughts to conclude on, Camille?
I think maybe a final thought about the future of Russia. I think that the parallel with 1917 Putin was making, it was interesting. In a sense, that now we're probably seeing the end of the regime that naturally evolved exactly from 1917. Because 1917, it was indeed revolutionary, very abrupt, and very radical change with the past. Because in 1917, the previous order was overthrown. The previous elites were persecuted and often just physically slaughtered. So whatever grew after 1917 in Soviet era, it was just very different from what had existed previously and headed by very different elites. But after that, you didn't really have revolution, you had evolution. So Lenin's regime quite organically evolved into Stalin's into Khrushchev's, and so forth. So while Putin himself may have personally very negative opinion about Lenin and his regime, Putin's regime is eventually, it is ultimately a result of gradual evolution of Lenin's regime. But now, quite probably after Putin, what we'll see is not the evolution, but the replacement of elites, far exceeding what we have seen in the 1990s. Framing it as a potential fall of Putin's regime, it could be spoiling the frame. Because what we'll probably see within the next few years, it's not so much the fall of Putin as the replacement of elites in Russia on a gigantic scale.
Yeah, no, you had this incredible point in one of your threads over the past few days that actually, everyone makes fun of Prigozhin for being a caterer. But in fact, some of Putin's ancestors got their first sort of hooks into power by also literally doing food service for the nomenclatura. So
Yes, and I think I find it very interesting because when I say that Putin's regime evolved from Lenin's, it does not necessarily technically mean that Putin's ruling elite, it kind of evolved, they're descendants of Lenin's commissars. That's not necessarily true, but to the much greater extent than most people would be ready to accept, they may be descendants of commissar servants, basically. They may not be descendants of commissars, but they're descendants of people who served food on their table, or guarded them, or drove them. So that's what probably Ibn Khaldun would frame as a sabiyya, kinda an interconnected group of interest, an interconnected group of families, that comes to power as a result of founding conquest, and then lives for a while. So Ibn Khaldun, he believed that Asabi usually lives for 4 generations. There will be usually no fifth one, and there are very rare exceptions are very, very rare. So if we kind of accept this interpretation, if we follow this model, uh, then Putin would be third generation, and Sergei Kirienko, basically the guy who appointed him as the director of FSB, would be the fourth. And most probably there will be no fifth one.
It's a very scary thing to contemplate, right? What sort of an overthrow of an entire regime, not just by changing the man at the top, but changing the entire sort of system. Like, why do you think that's the case, Camille? Why is your belief that whatever happens next is going to be actually a much more radical overthrowing than a radical transformation than just like a different person being on top?
Great question. Great question. One answer I would give because regimes do fall. Regimes do fall, and usually we do not foresee it until it happens. So, there was one great book about the late USSR. I don't exactly remember the author, but I love its name. It was forever until it ended. So that's what usually happens. That's what usually happens. And it's usually impossible to predict it exactly, but it will be very easily to explain it retrospectively, which everyone will be doing once it happens. So that's one thing. Another is that when we have an interconnected group of families ruling for decades with with a relatively low rate of being selected out and relatively low social mobility, paradoxically, it makes a regime more fragile. So the low level of being selected out, it may secure position of individual families, of individual interest groups, but it makes system as a whole very much more brittle. So I would say that the Russian ruling regime would be very much robust if it would be more enthusiastic about selecting its own members out, but it does not. I'll give you an example. I'll not give you exact figures right now, but I'll just convey the general thought. There is Russia. There's, let's say, generals in Russia. There are generals of army, of police, of federal security service, and many, many other services. So there used to be, for them, the maximum ages of retirement. And I'm giving you general direction of how it looks, not exactly the details. For example, the retirement age used to be 60. Then Putin rises it to 65, then to 70, then to 80. Then he just abolishes it at all. So what do we have? Putin is naturally a conservative person who doesn't want to experiment much, who doesn't want to experiment with changing the same people. He's much more comfortable to have the same people around. But if he was just retiring them one by one and getting new ones, you'd have their ruling circle, including Siloviki, the head of military, paramilitary, state security, who'd be more of mixed age. But if you just don't do it, if you just refuse it, you will have the same group of people who will basically stay in power until they die, and then they'll be dying just one by one very quickly. And that is a scenario somewhat vaguely similar to what happened in the end of the USSR.
Should I be how scared for the future of humanity should I be of that timeline, Camille?
Your question is quite revealing. Many Russians believe that the West and especially America conspired against Russia and just are plotting to disrupt it to microstates. And as I said, they just never comprehend how scared most of Americans, including most of political commentators, analysts, media, are about that scenario. So I understand your concern. But while I probably cannot assure you it's completely safe perspective, I cannot guarantee that at all. If you are scared of a potential scenario, maybe it makes sense to prepare it in case if it just happens.
This argument has been made in the U.S.-China context as well, that like just because we've seen such less transformative change in the U.S. over the past, over our like national history, that like big shifts are much more seen as crises than they are as potential opportunities, and like folks don't necessarily internalize, the upside of dramatic change. So fair point, Camille. I'm not sure you made me feel all that much better about it. Sort of like giant nuclear power with undergoing its own revolution in 2024. But there's I guess it's not necessarily something that anyone can really control.
Yeah, that's very true.
So I know, Camille, you've been doing some really cool stuff about the Russian military industrial base. You want to preview some of your research briefly here?
So basically, an interesting thing is just to look how the US, like intelligence and military commentary, evolves over time. So it looks to me at this point as if currently analysts, observers, commenters, they just put much lesser focus on the issues of production-based military production than they used to do it, let's say, in the Cold War. So if these concerns peaked, probably, I would say, in 1970s, it has been downhill since then. So, as a result, we have a pretty interesting situation. When, for example, the nuclear status of Russia is just discussed, as given, like grass is green, sky is blue, sun is yellow, Russia is a nuclear power. But usually, in most cases, Russia being nuclear power is not being problematized at all. For example, how Russia, a country that went through the post-Soviet collapse, that lost most of its machinery, that lost most of its supply chains when it comes against to machinery, to the military production, how can it still maintain its existing park of the weapons of mass destruction and the delivery systems, or even produce new weapons and delivery systems? Very short answer would be that with Russia losing its domestic machinery, while the global manufacture was being revolutionized through the implementation of a digital control, so basically the mechatronic revolution, Russia has just outsourced its production of industrial equipment abroad. And abroad, in this respect, it means to the US and US allies, because there are no other alternatives in the world. So at this point, both the maintenance of the existing park of the weapons of mass destruction and of delivery systems and their replacement, they fully depend upon the import of industrial equipment. In this case, it's mostly cutting machine tools, machining equipment, parts, components from the US allies, and maintenance and support by them. And this is the elephant in the room that, to my best understanding, almost no one is discussing, and when they're discussing it, it's not in the US. That would certainly be a great topic of discussion, a very big topic of discussion in the Cold War. And it gets almost zero attention nowadays. I don't fully comprehend why.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading on that, and having you back once we have an elite revolution in Russia with democracy being shouted from the hills.
So never, basically.
Maybe we'll do one or two before then. Camille, thanks so much for being a part of ChinaTalk.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Have a good day.